markets. We're joined now by Tai Hui. He's Regional Head of Economic Research for Southeast Asia at Standard Chartered. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. So let's talk about the rebound in stock markets that we've seen over the last couple of days. What's your reading of investor sentiment at this moment in time?
Well, I think if you look at the financial market as a whole, clearly for the past 2 weeks we've been burdened by a huge amount of risk aversion, partly driven by President Obama's plan on a banking reform, but also I think to do with the Chinese credit tightening or the proposed credit tightening. Clearly there's been a huge amount of attention on every tea leaf that's taking place right now in the Chinese banking system, whether banks are tightening lending standards or raising interest rates. All these are very much the hot topics right now on investors' minds.
Well, what is the next moment of truth here for investors? You mentioned Paul Volcker's speech to Congress in the U.S. today. Presumably they're going to be watching that very closely.
Absolutely. I think that is clearly the key issue in the near term. But of course, the ongoing questions about whether China will continue to tighten, I think will still be very relevant to the Asian markets.
Well, let's talk about China then. I mean, tell us how important China is to the rest of the world in terms of global growth. For example, would Asia sustain a recovery independently of a recovery in the West?
Well, I think it'd be very difficult for Asia to boom without a boom in the West. And therefore, if you look at our growth forecast across Asia, we still have a relatively conservative numbers for the region, taking into account of previous recoveries. For example, we're expecting 5.1% growth in Singapore this year, which is clearly below the typical 7 to 9% recovery that you see after a recession. In the case of China, I think some countries will continue to gain. For example, Indonesia, Taiwan and Korea have clearly benefited from the rising demand of China, but at the same time, there are other countries who will face more competition, in particular countries such as Malaysia and Thailand.
What are your biggest concerns with regards to the global economy right now?
Well, clearly, I think the question about whether we'll see a double dip in the Western world is on everyone's minds. Our view is there won't be, but if there is a premature tightening in both the fiscal and monetary policy in the West, then the risk of a double dip is genuine. Secondly, I think in Asia, the risk of asset bubbles, again, not so much of 2010 risk, but 2011 risk, that also should be on investors' minds.
Which Asian countries are the best plays at the moment?
Well, I think if you look at Asia, clearly the large domestic economy continues to win the votes of investors, partly because their growth performance are going to be more stable and less subject to the global volatility, but also the reality is that the central banks are able to tighten interest rate first and provide a more sustainable growth environment. Smaller economies, Singapore, Hong Kong, Thailand, Taiwan, these will face a lot more volatility in their growth pattern over the next several quarters, and therefore I think market expectations of their growth performance will also be equally volatile.
Thanks so much for your insights there.